In the year 2025, hip hop is in one of the oddest spots that it's ever been in during its entire time existing as a genre, with it somehow being more popular than it's ever been before, while also feeling less relevant than it's ever been before. Now, right off the bat, I know that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, as after all, to most people, relevancy and popularity basically mean the same thing. But before I explain what I mean, let me confuse you a little bit more. Because I also feel like hip hop is more experimental and diverse than it's ever been before, while also being completely stuck in its ways and unwilling to move on. Now, I know that sounds extremely contradictory, but the reasoning behind that is because hip hop as a medium is really split off into two distinct groups, with the first being the mainstream rap industry and the second being the underground scene. Now I know, this is truly groundbreaking stuff. We have mainstream music and then an underground version of that doesn't always follow the same trends as what's popular right now. We've never seen that before in the entire course of human history. But no, of course, I'm not trying to pretend that this is a modern day phenomenon, because after all, every time there's a popular type of music or culture, there's always a counterculture that's going to pop up around it to try to push back against the status quo. I mean, for example, if we look all the way back to 1960s America, you have a very conservative time where everybody is very similar with the beliefs that they hold and the way that they act. A lot of traditional values, a lot of belief in the government, a lot of belief in the country as a whole, and most people only seemed to care what was going on in their own backyards as opposed to paying attention to the entire world as a whole. So of course, in an environment like that where everything feels very safe and boring, you're gonna have people who are gonna want to rebel against it, and that's where you get the hippies, who of course were a bunch of teenagers and young adults who didn't want to work that 9 to 5 lifestyle and be a slave to the system, instead deciding to do psychedelic drugs, have promiscuous and of course, listen to a lot of really weird music. Which funnily enough are also traits that you could attribute to modern underground hip hop listeners, but that only shows more that even 60 years ago, people always had that need to rebel, and this has continued on throughout every decade. In the 70s, we had punk, in the 80s, we had rock, and in the 90s, we had grunge. However, one genre that I neglected to mention is of course hip hop, a fairly new genre all things considered, with it really only starting to pop up around the late 70s and really only gaining popularity in the 90s. And unlike these other genres that were often used in place of rebellion, I feel like hip hop was rebellious right from its very conception. Because after all, this is a genre that directly spawned from gang culture and people who were living in not great neighborhoods, basically putting a light on things that most Americans didn't want to pay attention to. And because of that, it seems like the genre was never going to be palatable for the mainstream. I mean, after all, they're talking about guns, selling drugs, gang activity, dropping out of school. I mean, these aren't things that we're ever going to want to show to our children. And on top of that, the average American is definitely not going to want to listen to it. It's a little bit too vulgar. And it was that exact mindset that led a lot of label heads at the time to try to cut off the rougher edges of hip hop and make it more palatable for the mainstream. And that's why throughout most of the 80s, all of the rap music that you would hear on the radio was either goofy or more lighthearted than what would eventually become popular in the following decade. However, despite the record labels actively trying to censor the more controversial parts of the genre, they would eventually find their way through and rise to the top somewhere around the late 80s. Because believe it or not, your average suburban listener actually does want to listen to hip hop, and that's all because of a little known phenomenon that is actually still prevalent today, which basically comes down to people always like to feel what it would be like on the other side. Now, if that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to you, basically what I'm saying is that your average middle class suburban white kid might never end up in a gang or even touch a firearm, but they want to listen to music that makes them feel like they could do that stuff. And it's not so much about them wanting to be part of that culture or live that lifestyle, although I'm sure some of them definitely do. It's more so about simulating what that lifestyle could feel like through listening to the music. Now, this isn't really going to make a whole lot of sense to you if you've lived your entire life in poverty and have grown up around this stuff throughout your entire childhood, as after all, if you've actually been in that environment, you know it's not fun. But if you've never actually been in an environment like that, it can kind of feel exciting. I mean, we got violence, we got revenge, we got people standing by their brothers. To the average listener, that's gonna sound like an action movie. And for a while, that exact phenomenon would make hip hop one of the most popular genres throughout the 90s. And gangster rap would produce star after star after star, with people like Tupac, Biggie, Snoop Dogg, all of course being completely entrenched in violence and murder, while also somehow being palatable to the mainstream, which seems like a complete contradiction. But during this period of time, people didn't really care. They found it fascinating. And while of course gangster rap was the most popular out of the entire genre, many different subgenres would also manage to rise to fame during the same time. And it seems like things were only going to get better from here, with the genre getting bigger and bigger as the years go on. But unfortunately, in 1996, things got a little bit too real. Because unfortunately, the infamous Tupac Shakur would pass away from a gang shooting, leading that entire audience that was once glorifying all the violence and gang activity to now be completely disgusted by it. I mean, we wanted to hear music about people dying in shootouts, but we never actually wanted to see somebody die in a shootout. I mean, that was never part of the contract. It's basically the same idea as people who watch nature documentaries. They like to see the lions fight, but the second that a zebra gets mauled to death, all of a sudden they're up in arms and it's way too violent for them to handle. It's overall a stupid mindset and it's very contradictory, but unfortunately that's the way that the mainstream audience was feeling at the time, so hip hop had no option but to try to change. I mean, come on, we don't want to see violence anymore. We're done with the gang stuff, we're done with the negativity. We want more positive music, and more than anything, we want to dance. And just like that, pretty well overnight, mainstream hip hop went from being music for the streets to being music for the clubs. We're not trying to make songs that are going to get the gangsters wilding out. We're trying to make music that's going to get the white girls twerking in the club. And of course, I am overly simplifying all of this because after all, we're talking about 40 years of hip hop history here, and I'm trying to simplify it down into about a 20-minute YouTube video. So there's no way that I could cover every little nitty-gritty aspect of what each city in America was doing at the time. I'm more so trying to give you a representation of the big picture and what the overall country as a whole was probably listening to on the radio. I mean, of course, places like New York and Atlanta probably had their own sound and culture at the time, but I'm talking about what everybody was listening to. And that was a lot of dance music. Yep, dance music, and more dance music. That's basically all hip hop was throughout the end of the 90s into basically the mid 2000s. In fact, it was becoming so much that I think people were getting tired of it. And this is really the first time that you can see the hip hop industry grow stagnant. I mean, after all, this type of music was working, it wasn't too edgy, it wasn't going to get too many people upset, so why not just keep doing it over and over again? And honestly, it was working for them because hip hop was consistently topping the charts as well as starting to get a lot of crossover hits with different pop artists, and it finally felt like hip hop was earning its spot in the lexicon. But of course, when things change so suddenly, not everybody's going to want to get on board right away. And to take it a step further, some people were actively resentful against this new style of music. I mean, after all, we liked gangster rap. It was working. Why do we have to water down our own music genre to make it more palatable for people who have never even been part of this lifestyle? Which is a very fair criticism, but at the same time, if you want your genre to continue to thrive, you gotta continue to innovate and change with the times, because if not, you're gonna get stuck in the past and completely forgotten about. I mean, look at something like jazz. But despite that, the frustration from the older generation would persist, and it was from this frustration that the term "that's not real hip hop" was born, something that we're going to hear repeatedly throughout the entire time that this genre has been around. As every time something new and different rises to prominence, there's always going to be people who are stuck in the past who aren't willing to change with the times. But no matter how you felt about the new sound of hip hop, there was at least a pretty big shift going on behind the scenes, because unlike the 80s and the early 90s where there was out of touch label heads basically running the entire show, by the mid 2000s all of those original gangster rappers that were being pushed down by the industry had now become the industry, with their voices carrying a lot of weight and them basically deciding what the culture of hip hop would be. But funnily enough, as things often go, the people who were once the outsiders would now become the gatekeepers, as they basically wanted the culture of hip hop to remain the same, and anybody who was different or a little bit odd would not be allowed in. And a good example of that is Kanye West, as when he first came into the game, a lot of people looked at him as a joke, somebody who would never be able to make it in the mainstream industry, and somebody who is just not gangster enough to be able to sell an image. But despite that, over the years he would prevail, and the type of music that he created, while not being traditional hip hop, was so different and experimental that eventually you just couldn't ignore it anymore. And when it came time for him and 50 Cent to go head to head in album sales, everybody thought that 50 was going to prevail. I mean, after all, he had the streets behind him, he had that sound of music that was popular for years. There was no way that he was going to fail. But despite that, Kanye was the one who won out. And that goes to show that innovation is good. New sounds and styles can really breathe new life into a genre that might be growing stale. And that's not to say that you have to give up on all of the classic sounds that people know and love, or have to completely change into a new sound if you want to stay relevant. You can do both. But it's always felt like the overall genre of hip hop has been pretty uncomfortable with this concept, as every time that something new and popular rises to the surface, they feel like their cultural significance is going to be wiped away, which does make sense when you consider just how heavily they were censored back in the 80s. But things weren't like that anymore. It was now the 2000s. You could have both. You could have the gangster rap with 50 Cent, and then you could have the pink polo Kanye guy who's making this weird 808 kind of techno type music. However, despite these couple outliers proving that being creative could really make a change for the genre, the industry would basically continue down the same path, creating that same old tired style of music over and over again with very little innovation. And things probably wouldn't have changed all too much in the following years if it wasn't for the rise of the internet, because this is where things got truly strange. Because during the late 2000s and the early 2010s, hip hop would become a lot more melodic, with some of the biggest rappers in the game being a lot closer to a pop star than a traditional rapper, which once again led a lot of the OGs to say, that's not real hip hop. However, I'm not really here to focus on that exact era of hip hop. Instead, I want to look at the internet age, because once again in the early 2010s, we would start to see a lot of niche and odd types of rap pop up on the internet. With the modern underground practically spawning from different apps like MySpace and Tumblr, with a lot of kids who felt like they never really fit in with the style of music or culture in their own city, with them instead spending a lot of their time on the internet, connecting to people that they never would have been able to before. And because not everybody was on the internet at the time, these communities felt a lot more tight-knit and niche. And on top of that, nobody felt like they were ever going to be able to make a bunch of money or really pop off in this internet space, and instead were only making music because that's what they wanted to do. And when you're not trying to appeal to an algorithm or do something to impress an audience, you can get very experimental, and that's exactly what would happen, with the earliest roots of emo rap really coming from this wave. But it's not like the internet was only being used by niche communities at the time, because there was plenty of rappers who were using it as a tool to help them get heard by audiences that they never would have been able to reach before. And for the first time ever, you didn't actually need the industry to be able to become a successful rapper. I mean, of course, if you signed a record deal, you would become wildly more popular than you ever could in a niche internet space. But at the time, the internet didn't need to be a better option than the industry. All it needed to be was another option, because before this point, there really was no other way to make it big in rap. You had to sell mixtapes, you had to hustle, and hopefully get noticed by somebody who had a connection to a record label. And if everything worked out, you might be able to get a hit song on the radio and be regionally popular. But with the rise of the internet, artists no longer needed the industry, they no longer needed that radio play. All you needed to do was record a music video with your friends, put it on YouTube, and you could build an audience. It sounds mundane by today's standards, but back in the day, it truly was revolutionary. And this is where we start to see the rise of groups like Raider Clan, ASAP Mob, and probably most importantly, Odd Future. A group that I truly feel added the final ingredient needed to build the modern underground. As well, Kanye definitely planted the spark of rebellion, with plenty of people watching him fight to be accepted by the industry. The average listener never really felt like they were Kanye West. I mean, you might have rooted for him, you might have even saw yourself in him, but he felt like a once in a lifetime artist who was able to get himself in the perfect position to really break through into the industry. This wasn't something that me or you would ever be able to replicate, but with Tyler the Creator and the rise of Odd Future, it showed people that you really could do it all on your own. All you needed was a couple of friends, a little bit of creativity, and access to the internet, and you really could become a rapper. And once those floodgates were open, they would never really close again because we would see artist after artist after artist pop out of the internet wave, with the entire structure of the rap game changing overnight. We would see the rise of artists like Lil B and Young Lean, who initially were treated as jokes and mostly laughed off by the mainstream audience, but despite that, they would carve out their own niche and build a very powerful cult fan base that would carry them for years and years. And from there, things would continue to grow, with Lil B being almost as influential as somebody like Kanye West when it comes to the modern underground scene, and Young Lean starting the whole sad boy aesthetic, with him eventually recruiting on artists like Echo 2K, Ty Boy Digital, and of course, Blade. And then on the American side, we had Space Ghost Perp, who would go on to start Raider Clan, which of course spawned the careers of many different underground artists, with the most prominent probably being Bones. Bones would go on to start Team Sesh. You had Puya coming from Raider Clan, who would later go on to put on people like Ghostmane and Suicide Boys. And eventually this wave of music would get so popular that you would start to see underground media pop up around it, with the most prominent one being No Jumper, who of course interviewed some of the biggest rappers in the underground at the time and helped to push their wave even further. And while once again nowadays this really doesn't feel all that special, you need to realize that before this point, if you were a rapper and you wanted to be able to tell your story in an interview format, you basically either had to get on a radio station, which was hard for anybody who didn't already have a hit, or you would have to get on a Smack DVD, which was pretty niche and basically only represented battle rappers. So with the rise of platforms like No Jumper and SoundCloud, the power was finally put back in the artist's hands for the first time ever, and from here, things would only get bigger and bigger, with figures like XXXTentacion and Ski Mask the Slump God eventually managing to break through into the mainstream and finally show the industry that people wanted something different. And during those years between 2015 and 2019, things were great. I mean, hip hop was more popular than it had ever been before, with it constantly topping the charts and seemingly a new rapper popping out of the underground every single week. We got all-time classics like Look at Me by XXXTentacion, EXO Tour Life from Lil Uzi Vert, and Japan from Famous Dex, all songs that seem like they never should have been popular mainstream hits, but despite all odds, they were able to make it onto the Billboard. You also started to see rap take influence from other genres, for example, rock as well as metal. You would start to see people screaming on beats. You would start to see people take cues from techno music with a lot more melodic and kind of trippy sounds. I mean, back in 2011, an artist like Playboi Carti would have been unheard of. Nobody would have even been able to fathom exactly what he was trying to do with his music, and he probably would have only existed as a very niche artist. But in 2017, he fit in perfectly, and not only did he fit in, but he thrived. In fact, all of these guys were thriving. And as much as legacy media tried to downplay and make fun of all of these new generation rappers, they weren't able to stop them. And in fact, the only reason that they were doing all of that is because they were afraid. Because while many OGs look back at the SoundCloud wave as an extremely stupid time in hip hop where a bunch of rappers basically only blew up based off the way that they looked and not the music that they were making, if you were actually around at the time and truly tapped in, you realized that SoundCloud was kind of a revolution. Because yes, while of course we had a bunch of artists like Lil Pump and 6ix9ine who really dumbed hip hop down to its most basic principles and became very popular off of the back of that, I think we all knew that they were going to be fads and were eventually going to fade away, but that doesn't mean that the entire wave was going to fade away. I've had plenty of people in the comments ask me the question, do you really think the SoundCloud wave was going to last long term? And my response to that is yes. Now, did I think the colorful hair, Instagram antics, dumbed down music, and face tattoos were going to last forever? No, definitely not. But that was really only the window dressing of the SoundCloud wave. The actual real movement behind all of that was about artists taking the power back into their own hands. Because all of these rappers were proving for the first time ever that you didn't need an industry machine behind you to be successful. You could actually do it on your own independently. Although unfortunately, the wave would never be able to reach its full potential due to a couple different factors, the first of which being some of the biggest stars dying at a very young age. This is often the main factor that people attribute to the death of SoundCloud rap, but in my opinion, that was really only the scapegoat. The two real reasons why SoundCloud rap died was one, the industry buying up all of the best talent, basically signing them to massive record deals and then completely shelving them so they couldn't produce music at the level that they once did when they were independent. You can see this trend over and over and over again. And while on its face it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, as after all, why would the industry pay so much money and then not do anything with all the talent that they signed? The reasoning behind this is because they didn't want the SoundCloud wave to be popular, because if it ever succeeded, it would prove that they were obsolete. So they would go on to sign all of the biggest names, take the royalties from their biggest tracks, before then going on to water down their image and basically destroy their reputation altogether. And then once all those guys were used up, they would move on to the next artist before then eventually running out of SoundCloud artists to take advantage of, so they would have to start creating their own with clone rapper after clone rapper. But luckily for us, the industry was really bad at trying to recreate that same energy that the initial SoundCloud wave had, and most of the people that they tried to plant were so obvious that people were able to sniff them out a mile away. So while they had definitely managed to slow down the independent movement, they weren't going to be able to stop it, because after all, they had no idea what was popular at the time and they were completely falling behind. And if things had continued the way that they were going, they probably would have fallen completely out of favor. But then we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is really where everything shifted once and for all. Because like I've said many times before in previous videos, and probably will continue to say in follow-up videos, everybody was locked inside, nobody could do shows, and well, basically the entire music industry would grind to a halt. As after all, it's not like anybody's going to be turning up to any music at the club anytime soon, people aren't going to be in their cars listening to the radio, you're not going to be going to a gym to listen to music there, so why do you need anything new? I mean, fuck it, if we're not able to perform live and make our money off of that, why are we going to bother to give you any music with any sort of energy? I mean, everybody's trapped inside anyways. Are you guys really looking for something that will make you feel alive? No, instead, here, take white noise. And that was basically the mentality of everybody in the industry at the time, with them giving us very low energy, dead sounding music, or on the other hand, nothing at all. However, this was a massive miscalculation by the industry because it would leave a wide open space for many different independent artists to be able to thrive, with TikTok finally coming to relevancy around this time and, well, basically no competition for many of the bigger artists. And in that short period of time, it kind of felt like we had a second gold rush on the SoundCloud wave. You had people like NASCAR Allo, Little Darky, Powfu, a bunch of weird and out of the box artists that definitely never would have been accepted by the mainstream industry and probably wouldn't have even been accepted by the SoundCloud wave if we're being honest. We're finally able to get their music and vision out there in its full, untapped, uncensored form. But unfortunately, this would only be a fleeting moment in history because the industry was not going to let this get away from them for a second time. They had underestimated the SoundCloud wave for far too long, and they almost let it completely make them irrelevant. And they were not going to let the same thing happen with TikTok. But luckily for them, the learning curve on this was a lot easier than SoundCloud rap. I mean, after all, SoundCloud had a lot of energy, it had a lot of aggression, it had a lot of things that the industry doesn't really like. They don't want you to be hyped up, going crazy, thinking that you can do anything. They want you to be numb and sedated, basically just going along with whatever they feed you. And TikTok was the perfect platform for that. For a song to pop off on that platform, it didn't need to have energy, it didn't need to have aggression. In fact, it didn't even really need to be good. All it needed to be was catchy. And if there's one thing that the music industry is good at, it's making lifeless, boring, annoying jingle music that they can play over and over again until it eventually gets stuck in your head and you have no choice but to listen. So from there, the game plan was simple. Find a random artist who really has no integrity or any creative vision whatsoever, bring them into a label meeting, tell them that you have a song for them that they're going to perform, and then AstroTurf the fuck out of it on TikTok until it eventually becomes a hit. Enter in artists like DaBaby, Roddy Ricch, Jack Harlow, Megan Thee Stallion. Yes, I know all of these artists were around prior to 2020, but they really got massive after TikTok took off. And similarly to what they did back in the 2000s, they would continue to spam the same sound of music over and over and over again. I mean, you can tell what's a TikTok hit a mile away. It basically has that same dead, lifeless feel to it. And while plenty of us are completely sick of that style of music, there's not really a whole lot that we can do because after all, the labels control the radio, they control TikTok, they control basically everything that we see online on a daily basis. They can pay off the media, they can pay different influencers to hype up their music, and well, money talks. And that's why for the past 5 years, we've kind of been stuck in this musical dead zone where it feels like the music industry isn't producing any new stars. People are coming and going almost overnight, and music feels more dead and manufactured than it ever has before. And I mean, I could probably end the video right here on a doomer note, telling you guys that things aren't ever going to get better and that the world is doomed and that seagulls are choking on plastic and blah, blah, blah. But that's not what I'm really here to do because not all hope is lost. All we have to do is look at genres like rock and country that were pretty well considered dead close to the end of the 2010s, but nowadays seem to be thriving more than ever. And I think the reason for that is pretty simple, because both of these styles of music have a lot of heart, feeling, and passion put into them. I mean, you can't really simply make rock music if you don't have at least a little bit of talent in music. I mean, anybody can hop on a trap beat and have an epileptic seizure, but when it comes to rock music, if you can't play guitar or at least have a little bit of vocal control, you're probably not going to make it very far. And when it comes to country, it's a very similar story. It has a lot more passion and real emotion baked into it. And on top of that, in recent years, modern country is finally ignoring all of the old heads who don't want the genre to move on or grow, with them taking different cues from other genres, including rock, pop, and even a little bit of hip hop. And while I'm sure all the old white guys in Nashville are pissing their pants on a daily basis over this, it's working. And I think hip hop needs to do something very similar if it's ever going to be able to thrive. It doesn't need to completely get rid of gangster rap. It doesn't need to lose all of its cultural significance. It can continue to do that while also innovating and bringing in different genres. Because people care about hip hop, they're always going to care about it in one way or another. But what it needs right now is a little bit of a kick, a little bit of experimentation, and I think it can regain its spot as the top genre in the world. However, the industry is very stuck in its ways, and it's going to continue to do what's profitable until the end of time, so our only real hope of getting where we want is the underground scene. And while I have plenty of problems with the modern day underground, I do think it's our best hope. But if you want to hear more about that, stay tuned because I'm going to be doing a follow-up video in the next couple days where I talk about the issues that the underground is going through right now and how I think with a couple tweaks it can finally regain the former glory that it had. So yeah, if you're interested in that, make sure to let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel because we are so desperately close to 30K and my only sense of self-worth is based off my sub count, so I need to hit that, guys. But with that said, I am Twisted World. Don't do drugs, don't drop out of school, eat your vegetables and brush your teeth every night. And if you're an unk like me, 24 years old, still living with your parents, get a job, bro. Get a job. All right, peace out. See you in the next one. Bye.